Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining our conversation on fact checking and combating misinformation in elections. My name is Simone Lobo. I'm a journalist at Media Nama, and I'm joined by my fellow journalist and colleague Saraswati. We will be moderating this conversation. Our goal for this short discussion is to provide a platform for fact checkers to share their experiences and insights related to misinformation during the 2024 elections. Particularly, we are narrowly focused on types of misinformation and disinformation observed during these elections, quantitative and qualitative assessment of this, and how platform codes and election commission codes of conduct ought to develop in order to evolve and address misinformation and disinformation during the elections better. With other countries into elections, insights on misinformation from India specifically will be of use globally at this point in time, given the scale of our elections. Fact checkers have been very, very important stakeholders in democracy and elections, and their insights into the unique trends and patterns of misinformation that they have observed in the past month or 6 months, I'm sorry, could be key to achieving a goal of an honest and democratic process. Our discussion will focus on the role of AI in elections briefly too. As before the elections, we observed a lot of rhetoric about the threat of deepfakes. However, if you would like an in-depth dialogue, I would recommend our discussion Deepfakes and Democracy. A recording of this can be found on our YouTube channel. We will also be hosting another event largely focused on AI regulation called Governing the AI Ecosystem on July 11th. Information for this is available on our website for anyone who's interested. Coming back to our discussion, audience questions are always welcome, and we will try to address as many as time permits in the last 15 minutes of this discussion. So please feel free to share your questions in the chat. Thank you. With us, we have today Abhilash Malik, the editor of Fact Check at Quint, Jency Jacob, the managing editor at Boom Fact Check, Kritika Goel, the head of editorial operations at Logically Facts India, Rajneel Kamath, the founder and publisher at News Checker In, Shivam Shankar Singh, a data analyst and campaign consultant, and Tarunima Prabhakar, co-founder of Tattle Civic Technologies. Unfortunately, Pratik Sinha, co-founder of Alt News, couldn't join us. But let's just begin our discussion. As I mentioned, we would like to start by understanding a quantitative assessment of these elections. So for all our fact checkers, can we each answer one by one and share our insights into what is the volume of misinformation we have seen in this election? That's what we'd like to start with. In terms of sheer numbers, what was the volume of misinformation that you or your organization have observed? How much of this was audio, video, text, and which platform saw the most amount of misinformation? And we would like to focus on YouTube in particular, just because of things we've heard, and a breakdown on the number of the fake and genuine complaints that you have received through your tip lines and other sources. So can we start with Jency?
Thanks, Simon. I'll share my screen and I've got some slides which I'll share here. So, between the months of March 1st to May 31st this year, Boom published about 258 election-related fact checks in English, Bangla, and Hindi. Now, these fact checks addressed issues ranging from AI-generated fake news to old and unrelated videos as well as communal claims. So this is broadly the breakup. So if you see, uh, though during this election we were expecting that AI generated fabricated claims would be the maximum, but that has not been our experience. At least we saw that those who were building these kind of narratives went back to the old and tried and tested unrelated election related videos and images being falsely presented as recent. So those were the maximum number of stories that we saw. Then we also saw AI generated fabricated claims, communal claims, and claims of rigging EVMs. So a lot of the claims were related to EVM rigging as well. 51% of the 258 fact checks that we saw involved some verified social media account or not. So, which means that when we looked at our total stories, 51% of the fact checks that we wrote had at least one social media account which was verified, spreading that narrative. So, when we also did the breakdown of it, about in 11 instances we saw that they were verified BJP accounts. In 6 instances, those were verified Congress X accounts, and in 4 instances, we saw it were verified Trinamool Congress X accounts. Uh, as I said earlier, AI generated fake news didn't turn out to be the massive trouble that all of us expected it to be. But there are a lot of interesting trends that we saw. Maybe we can discuss it as this discussion goes forward. But broad numbers that we saw is now this is only related to Boom, so other fact checkers may have a very different experience. 12 out of the 258 fact checks contained AI generated claims. Then out of this, three were deepfakes, nine were voice clones. So we saw a lot of voice clone videos as well. I've given an example here of Mamta Banerjee singing a Jai Shri Ram song. Again, that was a voice clone. Then there was another one which was quite popular, and most of us would have heard that. This is a audio conversation or a phone conversation between AAP leader Swati Maliwal and YouTuber Dhruv Rathi. Again, that was going around as a real conversation, but when we passed it through two detection tools, we found that the audio was generated using AI. Uh, Last, I would like to talk about political ad spending as well. So these are broadly what we saw. BJP again, as expected, being the top in terms of political ad spending on both Meta and Google. These are some of the numbers that we looked at. As you can see, about 73 crores that BJP spent only in the month of May. I'm sure these numbers are only for the month of May. Apart from that, we saw a lot of spending by Biju Janata Dal this time. In fact, more than the Congress, considering that they were fighting a very intense election in the state of Odisha. So we saw a lot of the money being spent by them, and then also Congress spending somewhere around 22 crores in the month of May. So broadly, these are the headline numbers that I have. And Simone, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jansi. We'll get back to everything that you've mentioned. Abhilash, would you like to take over now?
Yeah, sure. So we had
Okay, I believe Abhilash is frozen. Um, Jansi, another thing we would like to talk about was how much of these information was audio, video, and text. Do you have the data on that?
I don't have the specific breakdown here, but we would have seen a good number of text as well as audio. A video also. See, when we say that a lot of the old unrelated images and videos coming into play, many of these would be video as well. Though I don't have the specific number, though I'll search for it.
Uh,
But a good number of those claims were also video.
all right. And by platform wise, who do you think had a larger amount of misinformation? Now, something that we've heard was YouTube in particular had a lot of misinformation this election. Has that held true, or which platform do you think has observed more instances of misinformation?
Again, I wouldn't have the breakdown in the numbers, but across platforms we have seen these kind of images and videos. See, videos when it is specifically, it is definitely YouTube. You'll see a lot of the stuff again being generated on YouTube as well.
Mhm.
Many times, we have seen that it moves from one platform to the other.
Right.
A lot of the pages on Meta would be spreading this. Then it will move on to X, or then you'll also find them on YouTube. Then you'll also find a lot of them on moving on around on WhatsApp groups. So it's very difficult to put down a number or pin down a number or give it any ranking, which is why we haven't done a ranking even in our own study as well.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I see Abhilash is back. So, Abhilash, would you like to share with us?
yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah. So I we had a similar experience as what Jency pointed out. We looked at data from the 15th of March to the 15th of June, and in those 3 months, we published close to 300 fact checks in both Hindi and English. Some were obviously repetitions; they were not unique fact checks published. So some were translations of the English fact checks. But overall, we saw around 75% of the fact checks contained video claims, and the next was around 25% were images, and close to 10% were text and the other forms. We also do something called as a Neta fact check, where we fact check claims when a prominent politician makes it in an election speech or a campaign speech. So we published five of those also in during this time period. Like Jency pointed out, verified handles were the source of misinformation in our case also. We had close to 70% of the claims where we had seen at least one verified handle share that piece of misinformation. And we, if we talk about the different phases of the elections, we saw that the preliminary phases right before the voting, we saw there was a increase in misinformation. Once the election started, there was a lull period in the between during the phases of fifth and sixth, and then again towards the end, there was again a rise in misinformation. A number of facts published were increasing towards the end, and it actually continued even after the election results were declared.
All right, Abhilash. Can you share with us some data about which platforms seem to have a higher amount of misinformation?
Again, like Jency pointed out, the misinformation that we tracked was quite platform agnostic. We saw the same claims on multiple platforms. We were tracking actively Instagram, Facebook, and Threads, and we saw a similar sort of posts going viral on all these platforms. And then there would be a tweaked version of it going viral again on WhatsApp. So it's difficult to pinpoint which platform had most number of misinformation, but the same kind of misinformation was seen on all platforms.
All right. Yeah. I'd like to go to yeah, Saraswati, go ahead.
Just wanted to check with Abhilash, since you spoke about the variation of the scale and misinformation throughout the phases, could you give us some numbers on that? Like percentage-wise data would also work. Like what happened before the elections and during different phases of the election? How did the misinformation data vary?
Right. So of the stories published, we had around 40% stories published in the first two phases, like before the elections and until the end of the second phase. We had close to 40% of the stories published during that period of time. And then there were a few stories published out in the third, fourth, third, fourth, fifth phase. And in the last phase, again, there were quite a few stories that were published. And then even after the election was done, there were after the 4th June results came out, there was still some misinformation coming out about how the results turned out and how certain parties did in certain places. So those also we took into account. So around 20% of the fact checks were in the last phase and post results.
All right. Now, I'd like to move on to Kritika. Kritika, once again, we're talking about the volume of misinformation across platforms and how much of this was audio, video, text, and fake versus genuine complaints. Yeah.
Okay, so between 1st of February and 4th of June, which was the date of declaration of results, we did around 224 fact checks. This is only in English and Hindi, and this is only claims related to Lok Sabha elections. It does not include assembly elections, which were held simultaneously in Andhra Pradesh and Odisha. Of these 224 stories, around 43% of the stories that we've done were basically visual misinformation, but I'm only talking about old and unrelated with visuals. More than 50% of the content that we fact checked was visual misinformation, which is your videos and text. Also, to understand the magnitude of the problem and actually the volume that we're talking about, I also got some numbers from so basically all the fact checkers were a part of a project called Project Shakti. And the fact checkers and publishers were working together, and I got some numbers from them as well. According to their data, around 86% of all the fact checks that all of us had written were visual content. That's only to understand the magnitude or the volume when we're talking about what is the most viral form of misinformation, if I may say. So that's essentially what the numbers tell us according to our analysis and according to the analysis that's been also done by Project Shakti. As for your question about platforms, again, I think I don't have a very different answer. I think misinformation jumps from one platform to another, and that's something we've seen. We've not done any kind of analysis which tells us that there was more misinformation on Meta or there was less on X or YouTube. So I don't think so I can tell you a number, but definitely depending on which state was going to polls when, misinformation would change, the language would change, the kind of misinformation we're seeing, and misinformation targeting that state would basically surge. Yeah.
So we'll definitely get back to that because that is something we'd like to discuss. But for now, Rajneel, would you like to jump in and give us some of your input too?
Yeah. So I'm actually filling in for News Checker's managing editor, Ruby. She was actually leading the fact-checking newsroom during elections. News Checker functions in more than 12 Indian languages across the country. So starting with WhatsApp, one of the things we noticed between March and April was that the number of people we had replied to who sent us something to check had doubled just between March and April. And those numbers more or less held steady for May and June. So we definitely saw an election bump between March and April, and those numbers did vary a little bit, but they are much more than what we had pre-election. Coming to just fact checks, from between March 1st to May 31st, we published about 808 fact checks. Not all of them are translations, they're all hyper-local in nature. In terms of genres, 67% of it was politics, 7% was to do with other countries and international relations, 6% was religion, 2% crime, 2% was entertainment and celebrities, 2% health, 2% to do with violence, and there's an others category, which is 10%. When we try to map this by theme, about 52% of that, of 416 fact checks, were to do with the general elections. Vote rigging allegations were 4%. The wealth redistribution allegation was 1.36%. 1.24 is still the Israel-Palestine conflict. The removal of quota was 0.99%, and the Arvind Kejriwal arrest is 0.87%. A further analysis is 38% of misinformation was shared by verified persons and pages. This could be a little bit misleading because now to be verified on Twitter, at least you just have to pay. So from that perspective, it may not be a good barometer. 1% analyzed was targeting certain specific communities, 10% analyzed women, 14% was communal in nature, and 2% of these were amplified by mainstream media. I can go in a little bit more. We all apply certain labels to the misinformation that everyone checks. So 60% of it was false, 21% was missing context, 13 was altered image, and partly false was 6%. Just a couple of two more data points. In terms of the formats of misinformation, video with text was 46%, image with text was 25%, just video was 17%, and just image was 7%. Text is 3%, others is 2%. We also have language distribution, which I think will anyway focus on how much effort you're putting on it. One of the trends that we saw was that as soon as a phase of an election got over, after that, misinformation in that region, it would naturally come down and it would shift to where the next phase was going to be. Our election analysis is still going on, so I don't have numbers to share for that, but once it's ready, it will be published.
Thank you so much for that, Rajni. As you mentioned, let's talk about languages and phases now. Can we talk about languages that saw the most amount of misinformation, what were most prevalent? Kritika, do you have data on this too?
I'm sorry. So when we're talking about languages, as I said, around 224 stories that we've done, these are unique fact checks in English and in Hindi. For other languages, I don't have any granular data at the moment, but it really, the prevalence of a claim would depend on the phase in which that state is going to elections. Like, for instance, Karnataka was voting on 26th of May and 26th and 7th of May. So we saw a lot of misinformation around Karnataka or matters pertaining to Karnataka before 26th of April and then 7th of May. So I don't have granular data to tell you that we saw more misinformation in Kannada, we saw less in Hindi or English. But yes, it really depends on which state was which phase was the state polling in. I also just want to clarify that we publish in 5 languages, so which is English, Hindi, Telugu, Assamese, and Kannada. So whatever I'm saying keeping those 5 languages in mind.
Right. Okay. Right. Gen Z Boom also published phase-wise reports as the election went on. Would you agree with Rajneela and Kritika's assessment?
Well, so again, now, though I don't have the drill down numbers from date to date, but Rajin was mentioning about how tipline requests went up, and that is what also we saw. Like for example, in the month of April, we had about 15,000 requests that we saw. Now that was quite a high number for us in the month of April. So which means that the maximum phases that we saw during that time did see a lot of people reaching out to us and asking us whether what they are receiving on their WhatsApp groups or what they're seeing somewhere else is true or not. So the prevalence of what you see on your devices, it goes up as you're in the thick of the phase-wise election at that point of time. So yes, in the month of April, we saw a lot of claims coming in, which means that all those claims we were also fact-checking at the same.
Right.
So it peaked during the month of April. Then during the month of May, it started going down, and then towards the end, by the time you reach towards the end of May and June, we saw the numbers completely dipping.
So a question to Gen Z and all the other fact checkers. From all the tips that you got from anonymous sources and your tip lines, how many of them were genuine versus fake complaints?
What do you mean by fake complaints?
Like false alarms, for example. Like, the
See,
alarm.
in any tip line, we often it's very difficult to say whether what is a fake complaint, but we also receive a lot of spam.
Right.
So we have to filter that, so that's life cycle of any tip line. But as far as any tip line is concerned for any fact checking newsroom, it's one of the most important source of claim generation. Yeah, our tip lines are built for that. We take the spam out, and we also look at all those claims where, and even when we also match what we get on our tip line along with other tools as well. So whether it is Facebook or whether what we are seeing even being tagged by Twitter handles, people who are following us on Twitter, tagging us on various tweets and videos. So that's also an ongoing process. So we are always able to compare that.
All right. Yeah. Rajneel, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, it's very hard to figure out what is spam. I mean, one is our tip lines have automatic spam filters. So certain behaviors are deemed to be spam already. After that, a lot of queries do kind of come into us to check. What is happening, Simone, is because we're in this age of generative AI, now we just don't have to tell people what may not be correct. We also have to start telling them that, no, this is also indeed true. So it's never a false alarm because many things that are true also now have a feature where nobody wants to believe that it is true and therefore think it's misinformation. And we've had to point that out.
That is very interesting. Abhilash, you had something to add too?
Yeah, Rajni already covered it, but during the elections, we responded to close to 65% of the claims that we had received on our tip line. While not all of them were fact checked, sometimes people would just want to get some information about something that was happening around them. So we provided that information as well. We just didn't stop at sending people fact checks. We started providing additional information from news stories that the Quint would have done, or information that was available in the public domain from the ECI website or the ECI social media handle. So we started doing that also. During that time period, from what we have seen, we received around 20% of the messages were sort of spammy, or messages which we could not respond to, which did not have a verified or justified claim or anything attached to it. So those were the ones we could not respond to, but others we responded to either in the form of a fact check or in the form of a minister.
Kritika, you had something to add?
Yeah, I mean, something extremely similar to what Rajneel and Abhilash have already said, but I just wanted to say that with AI, the problem is that, the kind of legitimacy it just lends to content, plus the kind of legitimacy it takes away from verified content. So it's not just about misinformation we're talking anymore. We're also talking about the amount of information we're dealing with. So how much of information needs to be contextualized for people. Not restricting myself to the WhatsApp tip line or the kind of queries that are coming in, but also I think one of the speakers mentioned it. I'm sorry, I've forgotten who did. But the kind of tips that we receive online or something that comes to us through our DMs, etc. Sometimes it's more about what understanding the information. For instance, there are questions about the model code of conduct. There was also some kind of misinformation that we saw around MCC. So I think it's not, at least during elections, we didn't see that it was only restricted to misinformation. It was also about contextualizing information.
Right, interesting. So this is something we'll definitely bring up with Shivam later, but just to circle back to our initial discussion for now on numbers, I'd like to also talk about the number of complaints that you sent to platforms and what was their response. So if we could start with Rajni.
Yeah, so a couple of things, right? We do work with platforms as third-party fact checkers. So for some of them, we were already able to rate a certain piece of misinformation depending on the assessment that the editorial team used to do. So we anyway were able to do it for some platforms. I think it is, for example, on X or YouTube, we don't do that. So over there, you could individually go and report saying that, okay, this is misinformation, this shouldn't be there. I don't have any data because for the ones that we've reported, at least on X, we didn't hear back. And YouTube is, okay, thanks for reporting, we'll get back. And then, you don't get to hear back. We were already marking misinformation on Meta, so we kind of knew how much we were already marking on at least Meta platforms. WhatsApp anyway is like one-to-one this one, so we know how many actual claims we have manually responded to. So that of course was there. I think whenever we would also do a harms assessment sometimes with the fact check, and if there was something that needed to be escalated to say that this is of course misinformation, but also has the potential to cause real world harm or physical harm to somebody, then we would perhaps send that at least to Meta because that was a relationship we already have.
All right, okay. Jency, would you like to add to that? And
Yeah, not much different from what Rajnil has said. Because we are part of the 3PFC program with Meta, we are already marking those claims and we are labeling it, which means that Meta is already, taking a look at it in terms of how they algorithmically they are, bringing down the distribution of those posts. But when it comes to Twitter, X, and which is now called X, or otherwise YouTube, we don't really have a one-to-one communication with them in any form. With YouTube, we have raised a couple of complaints with them, and I can still see them existing on the platform. So action has not been taken yet, and it's an ongoing conversation that we have with Google and YouTube officials as well. Even going back to last week, when we had a meeting with them. As far as X is concerned, it's a black hole. You only end up reporting something. There is no route for even reaching out to anyone at the platform there. So the community notes is functioning. Some of my colleagues are also there on community notes. So that is a still small part of what one can do to reach out to the platform there. But otherwise, there is no direct communication that we have with X.
Abhilash and Kritika, would you like to add to that, or are you in agreement?
I just want to add one thing, that not individual claims, but collective requests like we've sent to Meta, for instance, on their ad library. We've still seen that despite requests, despite sending them queries, despite telling them about the content which was live, till the time the story was published, the content was still up there and we haven't really heard back from the platform. That's just one additional thing that I wanted to add.
Right. Okay. So another thing that we wanted to mention was how much of the content did you all see was complaints about political advertisement, and how many of them were complaints about hate speech? So if we could get numbers breakdown to that. Rajni gave us detailed information about that. Kritika, could you add some or
Sure. Sorry. So you want to know about hate speech and political ads?
political advertisements? How many of them were flagged as misinformation in your complaints?
Okay. To the platforms, right?
Yeah, and
So
as many as you fact checked too.
yeah, so as I mentioned that specifically, for instance, when I'm talking about Meta's ad library, there was quite a lot of content that we flagged to the platform. I also want to clarify because the rest of the fact check over here are a 3PFC partner. Logically, Facts in India does not work with Meta. We work with Meta in the UK. So that's why I mentioned that there are no individual requests or claim requests that we sent to the platform, but there were collective requests, for instance, when we are going through the ad library and the problematic content that we saw there, which still exists on the platform. It was not taken down, and we did not really hear from the platform, despite repeated requests. There were multiple violations when we're looking at those ads which are running on the platform. It's not just misinformation, it's also hate speech, and some of them are at the intersection of misinformation and hate speech. It violates multiple policies that Meta itself has, which is the authorization process it has for ads, the disclaimer, who's the ad paid by, any kind of imminent harm it's likely to cause, or voter suppression, etc. Or multiple policies basically were being violated through these ads. That's something that I want to mention, or that's something that I can point out here. If you're also asking about the kind of requests we received from the users, again, I don't think so I have that sort of data, or I don't think so that there was any particular ad that we received from the user from a particular platform that had to be fact checked.
All right. Okay. Abhilash, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, again, we didn't receive any kind of complaints against political advertisements from our users on our tip lines or anything. We also didn't notice much of it on Meta. We also are a 3PFC partner with Meta, so we have a direct communication line with them. It's easier for us to reach out to Meta as a platform than a Google or Twitter, which is, again, like Jency said, it's a black hole. We also had reached out to YouTube for some stories that we had done, and we pointed out that there were misinformation and disinformation in some cases also. Some of them were, we were told that the channels were demonetized. Some videos are still up without any action taken against them. Regarding hate speech, of the total stories that we had done, I mean, hate speech again is something that we have to categorize internally and assess what would consider a hate speech. But from what we have categorized, we did around 25% of our stories had a communal tone to it, and they were targeting one community or the other. Of the stories that we have done during the time period that I had mentioned earlier. A lot of them, I would say, were hate speech, which I would consider as hate speech in this.
All right. Yeah. So we'll definitely get back to platforms and platform regulation, but for now we'd like to focus a bit on AI. Now I've seen Jency added some context in his presentation and told us that a lot of us were expecting this to be the deepfake election. So I know I would like I've seen Logically Facts has a report out for AI generated misinformation. So if Ritika, you could give us some numbers of deepfakes you've seen and how many you've detected and how many of them were cheap fakes or simply edited?
Nearly 4% of all the stories that we've done were deepfakes. And I also want to clarify that by deepfakes, I don't only mean deepfake videos. There were also audio clones that were used. So we, of course, anticipated the problem to be extremely big. But at least as per the analysis that we've done, and if I were to give you absolute numbers of the 224 stories that we've done, only 8 stories were related to AI-generated content. That's essentially the data that I have. I just want to mention 2 more things over here. That is, when we're talking about AI, one thing that we saw, there was a lot of reliance on AI-generated content for political campaigning during these elections, as opposed to only deepfakes or audio clones being used for for information manipulation. So that's definitely one thing. Again, I think this is something that we touched upon previously, but we've also seen that how AI generated content has led to erosion of trust. It has led to planting that seed of doubt in your audience's or your reader's mind, which makes them question even the legitimate information that they're engaging with. We've also seen that with deepfakes, deepfakes or AI generated content. It's become very simple for people to say anything and then, um, later say that, oh no, that's a deep fake and we never made that statement, which is also known as, which gives them plausible deniability, or also is known as liar's dividend. We've seen that happen during this election as well. There was a video of a BJP leader from Uttar Pradesh who first made a statement and then later went on to say that no, it was a deepfake. All of us had written a fact check on that as well, and we said that we've been able to, find the original, or we've been able to find the source of the video, and it's not a deepfake. So I think these are certain things that we really found were prevalent, and these were a few challenges and a few things which need to be kept in mind when we're talking about artificial intelligence, or we're talking about AI generated content at large, because it's not only about the fakes which are created, it's also about how the technology itself is being used to create any kind of information as well.
Yeah. Right. Thank you so much for that. Abhilash and Rajneel, would you like to add anything to this with related to AI and misinformation?
Yeah. So I think one thing is we didn't see any democracy destabilizing deepfakes the way one may have seen in Slovakia, for example, which happened just 2 days before an election.
Mhm.
We definitely did see manipulated media using AI that were very viral, that were widely spoken about, especially involving celebrities, for example, and mixing celebrity culture with politics. So those were two things that we saw, and I mean, I think we of course wanted to be prepared, because after Slovakia's experience, everybody was talking about it. The World Economic Forum had by then said that the biggest short-term risk this year would be AI-generated misinformation. And the other thing is, while AI was definitely used in these elections for, creating digital clones or things like that, not everything was harmful or misleading in that sense.
Right.
The idea would be to either use it for satire or to try and make memes out of it.
Mhm.
So, and that's there. And the general election, perhaps because the technology itself is so new, people are also experimenting with what the technology can do. And we do have elections a couple of months from now. We'll actually now know what they've learned or not learned as far as deepfakes are concerned.
Okay. Yeah. All right then. So
I agree with what Rajni and Chatika have also said. I mean, we also saw a lot of audio clones rather than full-fledged deepfake videos that one may have anticipated. Deepfakes were actually used more for political advertising than spreading mis or disinformation. There was a deepfake of Karnanidhi down in South, where we saw his video was used to sort of ask for votes. Um and in some instances of these where it was genuinely a deepfake, which was advertised as a deepfake also by the political advertisers, we had to do a story telling people that this is a deepfake. It wasn't a fact check, but we had to tell our readers that this is a deepfake and this is how it looks. That's pretty much it, because we also were getting I mean, even people were concerned about the use of deepfake. So we were getting those videos, those deepfake videos on our timelines. People wanting us to tell them that if it was indeed a deepfake or not. So we responded to some of them, and we published a couple of stories telling people that yes, this was a deepfake.
all right. So now that we've established all the numbers, I'd like to go over to Shivam and say, as a political observer, what are your insights of all of this? From a qualitative perspective, what do you think was something unique or different about misinformation in these elections?
So even before we get into any of that, I would like to talk about latest information. So very core of it, any kind of misinformation, disinformation, it's a tool for an end objective. And especially in politics, that objective is to get votes. What do you need to do to get votes? You need to establish a certain narrative that basically tells the people who are to go and vote that you are better than the other side. And they should be voting for you for this reason or that reason. Once that's established, what ends up happening is that we actually talked a lot about this when we wrote this handbook, is that any political party has an objective. Below that objective, they end up deciding on a context, on why are people going to relate to a certain piece of news? Why will people share a certain piece of news? Below that comes a campaign. A campaign is essentially a set of information that they're going to flood with over a period of time. So it's not one specific piece of content. The content bit comes in last. And that is what we are fact checking. That is what is misinformation. And essentially, if you're trying to form a narrative, oh, we stand for a particular religion and the other side is anti that religion. A lot of the
Shivam,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm not able to hear you clearly. And I think there's a lag.
Yeah, there's a slight
Just
lag.
me or
I'll try moving to a different connection, but is it okay
Sure.
now?
Yeah.
maybe you can switch the connection and then sort of go over
Okay.
your answer again so that we
Yeah.
have clarity about, yeah.
Makes sense. I'm just connecting to it.
Meanwhile, Simon, you can continue with other questions.
Right. So, I guess I'd like to go to Taranima. So, Taranima, from a tech perspective, what do you think was a new challenge that you've seen with detecting misinformation?
Yeah, I mean, we're not strictly in the business of detecting deep fakes ourselves, but what is quite clear is that actually the visual manipulations are easier to detect. But also because fact checkers are able to often trace back the original video using techniques that have already existed for out of context, like some of the older traditional forms of manipulation. Where we're seeing a new challenge is actually audio, and especially when there is audio without any context, without any visual element to it. That's where tracing anything becomes quite difficult. And that seems to be also where forensic experts struggle. I think the other bit to understand through the election period and some of the forensic tech tools that have been used is that no tool gives you a yes or no binary answer, right? Like they always give you probabilistic answers. And we're also entering a world in which, because different companies are vying for deepfake detection as a business model, these detection models are often developed as proprietary technologies, and that makes it actually harder to even understand what these probabilistic scores mean, right? So to some extent, they might give you a sense of, this is visually, this is where we think some of the manipulation might have happened, but still it is probabilistic, because similar to the technology that is used to develop these deep fakes, which is GANs and deep learning, the the detection side is also using the same kind of techniques, and these are like probabilistic and very opaque. Like even the machine learning side of it is not something that you can scrutinize, right? So I think in general, one that to actually trust the detection side of the game, we probably need more transparent approaches, and we need actually the academic and the research community to also step in and do some of this work more transparently. Over the last 1 year, 18 months, we're seeing lesser and lesser research being done in the open on this. A lot of it is now actually being done inside companies. And secondly, I think in India in particular, given our issues with languages, dialects, that we mix multiple languages, right? Again, detection of audio, we need contextual sort of research from here as well, and we need contextual data sets. Yeah.
So we'll definitely get back to that, and we want to talk about technology for sure. But Shivam, thank you for joining again. Yeah. So you were talking specifically about misinformation and disinformation and its end goal. Mhm.
Yeah. I hope I have a better internet connection now. But essentially, what I was getting at is it's important to understand why anyone circulates misinformation, especially in the political context. And a large part of it is that people want to get votes at the end of it. That's the end goal. What do you need to get votes? You need to convince people that you are better than the other side. So there are two ways to do it. Either you present yourself as great and grand and someone who like no one can compete with, and the other way is to show the other side down, tell how evil and bad the other side is. When you have these two things, you have different objectives and narratives within these setups that you're trying to formulate so that people are convinced that you are the one to vote for.
Right.
With any narrative, there will be a lot of true content that goes out. There will be real incidents that happen that are out of context. There will be incidents that happen that are even in context, but they'll be presented as something larger than, say, a phenomenon actually is on the ground. A misinformation would be a part of it. Disinformation would be a part of it. AI generated fake content would be a part of it. But ultimately, what any political side is trying to do is to convince people of a certain narrative. When any fact check comes, we are focused on the content itself, which is actually the last step in the chain. So there's an objective. Below that, there is a narrative that a particular party is trying to set. And within every election campaign, there are multiple narratives. One narrative could be about the economy. One narrative could be about religion. One narrative could be something about caste. One narrative could be the global image of the country or something like that. So there are multiple narratives. Within all of these narratives, there is a certain context that leads people to believe a certain piece of information. And I don't know if the internet's working.
No,
It is. We can hear you.
Am I still audible?
Yes.
Perfect, perfect. So yeah, within that, there is a context which leads people to believe a certain piece of information. If it is out of context, if people's lives and their experiences and their understanding of the world does not align with the piece of misinformation being circulated, no one's going to believe it. So you need to pick up things from their context and their understanding of the world and create misinformation based on that. But just creating misinformation, one piece of misinformation or two pieces of misinformation is not going to do anything politically. It's quite irrelevant. So even when things like AI come in, like if you just used it to make one deep fake, it's going to be irrelevant. What is relevant is when it's a part of a larger campaign where someone's being flooded with a certain propaganda message, a lot of it real information, out of context information, fake information. That's when it becomes effective.
Right.
And that's when the second part of it comes in, whose incentive it is to circulate misinformation versus whose incentive it is to fact check it and correct it. So political parties have a very clear and a very clear focus on, okay, this is why we are trying to spread this particular message. On the other hand, there are fact checkers, there are civil society organizations, there are media and journalists who are trying to fact check it, and their incentive essentially is social good. There is no monetary incentive per se tied into circulating a fact check. So how many people receive the fact check versus how many people receive misinformation is a major focus of my work, at least when it comes to political campaigns.
Right.
Because the opposition who gets supported by the fact check itself, who gets the political dividend out of discrediting a piece of fake news, is the one who is benefiting from fact checking. So at the end of it, it is their responsibility to circulate the fact check and get it out to the most number of people possible. But then things like resource disparity between two parties come in. So it's actually, in my view, a much trickier thing than just the number of fake news content that came out, because believability and how much people are buying into it and how much political essentially effectiveness any piece of information has is the relevant component. And in this election, at least, somehow I saw fatigue setting in. A lot of the fake news, a lot of the misinformation was on exactly the same issues and exactly the same narrative. And anyone who was going to support that narrative was already voting for a particular political party. It's not like they got convinced because of one piece of misinformation. So my own understanding of the scenario is that the domain and the landscape is changing. Now, a lot of the AI and the deepfake will get used for testing out hypotheses, because the current narratives have reached a certain amount of saturation point. And that is where the technology and potential for misinformation scares me, because it will not be a part of a campaign anymore. What it will be is a testing ground. They're going to, like any political side, is going to select 10 or 15 different narratives and then throw out deepfake content, fake misinformation content, and see how people react to it. And we will potentially only see the impacts once they've already figured out that, okay, this piece of misinformation is resonating, this agenda is resonating. So we should be creating 10x the amount of content on just this piece.
Right. So thank you, Shimam. Now, based on that, I'd like to throw this back to the fact checkers and see what have you noticed about the new trends and misinformation tactics. Now, if we understand it, relevant parties have this understanding. So what are the misinformation tactics that they've noticed? And I'd like Saraswati to take over.
Yeah, Simon, I think you've already said the question. Since Shivam has spoken about it briefly, actually in detail, we would like to start with Jensi because he's already raised his hand.
Yeah, so the reason why I raised my hand is because I completely agree with what Shivam said, that this time we did see a fatigue coming in when it came to claims that we were receiving. And now that fatigue is not something that can be quantified in any form. But my observation, having this is the second general election we are doing, and I've lost count of the number of state elections we have fact checked over the last 7 years. And my experience this time was that there was something very different that happened in this election. Uh, See, usually what we see is that there is an entire network of accounts that uh, who are probably on the forefront. They are the ones who are pushing out the maximum number of narratives in terms of the agenda. The narrative is obviously being set up by someone, but all the fake claims that are going out are usually coming in from accounts, either pages who are known or not known, and some of them which just spring up during the elections. This time we saw something unique without taking names, because the misinformation was set right from the top in terms of the political leadership. What we saw is that everyone was trying to address that, either trying to address it or to take it further or trying to counter it. It was not the minions or the people who were in the mid level or the second rung political leaders who were pushing out false information. So that was one of the unique observations that I had about at least this election. Apart from this, some of the trends that we also saw, while it is true that deepfake didn't play a very big role, but political parties were testing it very well. They were checking whether a lot of the deepfakes we saw were memes or were satire, right? They were face swapping videos where they will take one of the political rivals face and plaster it on some some AI generated process that they will use, and they will show either a dancing video or they will show something else which were in the intent was to make fun, and the intent was to make fun of the person whom they are targeting. Now a lot of this was being done, and I feel that that while they knew that this is not going to work and people will be able to see it through, because some of this were really poor quality, they were testing it, and they are testing it for the future elections. They're trying to see how this will work, whether the people are receptive to it, whether they will accept it, whether they understand. A lot of the videos, I know that people understood that it is actually not a true video, but they anyways enjoyed it, and they liked it because um, it 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 subscribed to their point of view or their political ideology they follow. So these are some of the testing grounds. At least this election was a testing ground. So this is what I said a few weeks back also. While as Rajneel says that that it was not a democracy shaking election or a destabilizing election, what it also means is that, and as Shivam said, what we are going to see in the future elections is what we need to keep our eyes on. We can't take our eyes off, because this is a new tool or it's a new technology that everyone is very excited about. As the tools get better, more and more people. In fact, one of my colleagues, in one of the previous election, during the state election, she created her own voice clone of two political leaders and showed how easy it is to do it. She didn't require any fancy tool to do it, nor any fancy understanding of how it has to be done. Sitting, on her laptop, she managed to make it and push it out. So this is how easy it is going to get when it comes to AI generated videos and voice clones and images. And more as we go forward, as the tools get better, that is where the challenge for all the fact checkers are going to come.
Right. Rajneel, if you could also add to it, focusing on the misinformation tactics part, and it would be great if you could give specific examples like Jency did.
Yeah, no, just adding to what Jency and Shivam said, right? In this election, what we also saw was lower margins than previous elections. And when you try to translate that to now the coming state elections, you realize that when margins are lower, the incentive to undertake or to engage in mischief is therefore a lot higher.
Right.
And that's why, like, I think the assembly elections a couple of months from now is a good test of what kind of tactics will be deployed um, by those who are contesting. Like in one of the areas in Bombay, the margin was just 48 votes, and that's 48 votes at a parliamentary level. So you can now imagine when Maharashtra does go into elections at a state level, how hotly contested it is. Another thing that we typically tend to we see is how tactics that are used globally end up coming into India as well. And around the same time that Maharashtra and Haryana and I think Jharkhand will be going for elections, you will also be seeing elections in the US. So a lot of how this technology is being used there or is being deployed there, we will also learn from those strategies or tactics, and then that will kind of flow outwards to other countries. And India will also, of course, be one of them. Just in terms of, AI generated media, one, of course, is Taranum and I have this conversation. How do you define what is what, right? A deep fake, a cheap fake, AI generated. Kritika really helped put some of these definitions together so that, we have something as a starting point. But even though we did these definitions, the deepfakes analysis unit, which was set up to specifically look into this, would come across cases sometimes that didn't fit these definitions. So you had to go back and change it. In many ways, what you were seeing was older tactics spreading misinformation now interspersed with AI in the form of, changing a few words using AI, for example. How do you add disturbances at the back so that when you add those disturbances, the tools that you use will not be able to detect it properly? One of the things with audio voice clones, for example, is yes, you can use the tools and you can manually use it to say that this is not AI generated, but can you then with 100% conviction say that that voice belongs to the person for whom it is claimed to be belonged to? Like this was an actual case we saw, which we had to look into. We ran it through the tools. Everybody said, no, this is not a deep fake. There is no way you can replicate the level of intonation and anger that this person has displayed on that clip. Also, like I think AI has not reached that stage from that particular language where this is possible. But then the experts also got back and said, but we can't surely tell you that it belongs to that person. And that's when we realized, like, there are actors today who have deep baritone voices, who have two people on their payroll to basically mimic their voices when brands need it and collect royalty. So when you're listening to, let's say, somebody else's voice, you'll think it's, oh, this is actor A, but it might actually be somebody who's authorized on actor's A behalf to mimic that voice.
Right. Kritika? Then we can go to Abhilash and then Varunama.
I honestly have a very, very small point to make. And since you asked a question about cheap fakes and what are the other kind of editing techniques that we use, I just wanted to say that one thing that while there definitely was a lot of fatigue, one thing that we did notice, and it continues to be the same, that these elections were equally communally charged as other elections have been, or other news events around which we see a lot of misinformation. And the thing is, while content that people are passing off as real can be fact checked, memes cannot be. Then people come back at you and say that, oh, you don't have a funny bone, oh, you can't take a joke. But to be very honest, I think it's also important for us to understand that how many of us are actually able to understand that satire, or how many of us are actually able to understand that sarcastic. A lot of people, we tend to sometimes assume that it's satire, so we don't have to fact check it, and it's I think a very fair assumption that a lot of us make. But the thing is that we sometimes also tend to think from a very urban center centric point. We don't always think about the audiences in the rural parts of the country, or we don't think about the audiences who might not know so much about AI and deep fake in the technology itself. So I just wanted to make that intervention.
Abhilash, I think you wanted to add to it.
Yeah, I mean, most of it has already been covered, but regarding the tactics that were used this time, also, like Jency and Shiram correctly pointed out, we did notice a fatigue in the type of misinformation that was shared. A lot of fact checks that we did were videos and images that were shared back in 2019 as well. And the same videos and images were reshared by users, not even party members or party supporters, but regular social media users would had come across those at some point or the other, and they had shared it on their social media platforms again in 2024. So that was one thing that we noticed about the tactics, and I think the other thing to sort of talk about is that how political parties, because of the ECI's directions on mis and disinformation before the elections, and because there was a lack of sort of understanding on how far they can push the line when it comes to deepfakes, even for political advertising. There was that sort of apprehension from the political parties as well, because just before the Lok Sabha elections, we saw elections in other states, MP being one of them, and there was one particular cheap fake of Mayawati that was shared during that time. So in one video, she was showing support for the BJP, and in another video which came out in the same week, she was seen showing her support for the Congress. So even something as basic as that, it was very poorly edited. It was a cheap fake, not a deep fake again. But something as easy as that was not something that we noticed during the Lok Sabha time. So I agree with Rajneet when he says that there might come a time when we'll see active inclusion of deepfakes in the space of mis and disinformation. But I think even the political parties are trying to see how far they can push that line as of now.
Tarun, you wanted to add something? Please do.
Yeah. I think I was just like reflecting on a lot of the different comments that have been made. So to start with, where what Shivam said, right, which is that the goal of political campaigning is to set narratives. Then to connect it to what Rajneet said, which is that hotly contested elections is where actually the fight of narratives will become the strongest. Um, I think I was also just thinking, and therefore we're saying that if to some extent AI contributes to believability, it's a major concern. But from actually just from what everyone was saying, I was just thinking, but again, I'm not sure what of this is new to AI. I think we've been since the last 7-8 years, we've been trying to do these media literacy experiments, telling people that content on the internet should not be trusted, and it's in that backdrop that we now have AI tools, it sort of coming and creating, or we can use AI to create certain kinds of content. And to Kritika's point, maybe some of these media literacy interventions have not percolated to all the parts of the country, and so maybe some of us know more about technology, know more about how things on the internet spread, and therefore we're more skeptical, right? But I think if let's that is the basic premise, that content on the internet should not be trusted. You should look at the source. You should look at the motivations of the person sharing content with you, right? All of that applies to AI as well. Uh, I think what is also so something that has come through in a lot of people's comments, uh, but I'm just going to state it out explicitly, is that the concern now is that when we are operating in a world where we're telling people don't trust what you're seeing on the internet. The consequence also is that people are also distrusting true headlines, and this is something that you see from media literacy interventions when scientists have gone and studied. Like you have these media literacy games, you do these media literacy modules. What it does is it reduces people's perception, or it makes people more skeptical about headlines in general. Not that it only makes you skeptical about bad headlines. It makes you better at discerning bad headlines. It also makes you worse at discerning true headlines, right? So I think, therefore, like, maybe what is then important to focus on is how do you assert that what is true is actually true, right? And that is actually very challenging, because if you, like, if I had to put on like that statistician hat on, you always like reject the null, right? You can always say this is, we can say with 70% degree of confidence this is not fake, but we cannot say with like 100% degree of confidence that this is true. That's always the harder thing to do. Yeah, I'll just pause at that. Oh, actually, yeah, one other thing I wanted to add was that, this distinction of deepfake or not, AI generated or not, I actually find that somewhat confusing, because we do combine all sorts of, like, Photoshop now has AI in its editing tools, right? And platforms will have these filters where they let you like whiten your face, like let you make your face whiter, whatever, right? So, and these are all like AI enabled filters. So to me, then this question of whether it is AI or not, because what we will probably be doing is using, say, some of these platform filters and splicing sections of the video, right? And so it'll just be like a combination of all of these different things. So I keep thinking, like, yeah, to what extent is this question of like, is this AI or not AI? To what extent is this important, specifically in the context of misinformation when it comes to campaigning? I think there are other contexts in which it's a very important question to ask.
Right. Since we are talking about the distinction between true and false content, like apart from AI, I just wanted to get a sense of, is there an analysis of the trends that we've observed in misinformation content? I mean, not just tactics, but misinformation as a whole. Are there any new trends that we've observed this election? Misinformation and the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. If we could focus on that. Abhilash, you can start if you'd like to.
Sorry, I lost your voice in between. Could you just repeat that?
Yeah, I was asking, since we're talking about the distinction between true and false content, and not just in context of AI, we would like to get a sense of, the trends that we've observed this elections in the misinformation type, like, whether it's misinformation, whether it's the distinction between misinformation and disinformation specifically.
I mean, we always have this discussion also while we look at any kind of content, any kind of claim that comes to us. Like I said, there were a lot of claims that came from 2019, and 2019 was a very different time in the mis and disinformation space. So there were very simple rumors about things that would go viral, and people would start believing them. People have become a little more sort of critical now, and they've understood the understanding of things has increased now. So at that point of time, we would always think, if this piece of content, which was again viral in 2019 and people had in a way dismissed it, has come back. So should we still do it as a fact check? Because there might be some people who would be confused or who would believe this. So again, we always used to run into this situation where some of us would say that this is done intentionally, or some of us would say that this wasn't done intentionally. So there was a difficult line to draw between mis and disinformation. I would, in my sort of understanding of things, when there is a critical election going on, and like Rajni pointed out, the margins were this small, I would say I would categorize most of this content, even if however silly it might be, however silly it might sound, was disinformation, because it ultimately did have a malicious intent, and it did impact some voters, and it impact some parties in a negative way. So I would say most of the content that we fact checked was disinformation.
Do you have any numbers on that?
We don't classify like that. So like Rajni said, we classify as false, missing context, and things like those. So we don't classify as mis or disinformation in internally.
Right. All right. Jency, would you like to add to that in context of trends in misinformation?
Yeah, I kind of agree with what Abhilash has said. See, when it comes to elections and when it comes to events where, whether it's a war-like situation, or whether it is a tension between two countries, um, or between two communities, there is the scope to say that something was misinformation is very low. A lot of it is actually disinformation. Now, how people perceive it and how people see it may you can always say that that it is either misinformation or disinformation. Like for example, someone may receive something and they may add some extra masala to it and forward it, maybe because they genuinely believe that what they saw is true. um, so that is misinformation, right? I mean, we often say that what you know is supposed to be false and then yet you forward it. That is what is disinformation. And just to give a very simple example, so a lot of the stuff that we saw during COVID, not the communal claims, but to say that that you consume this or consume that, or be careful of this or be careful of that, all of this, that was misinformation in by and large. But when the moment it moved into a category of saying that a certain community is spreading something, that is pure play mischief, and that was disinformation. So again, when it comes to also EVM rigging stuff that we saw, many times when people forwarded us stuff, they genuinely believed it, that that there's something wrong. But then when you scratch the surface, you find either that video or that images from 2019 or some previous election, they have nothing to do with this election. So it was definitely not disinformation that way. Many of them actually, because of the prevailing circumstances and the conversations that are going around saying that you cannot trust electronic machines, a lot of people genuinely forwarded it. So these are some of the nuances that we probably have to understand. But when it comes to very hotly contested elections where both political sides or multiple political sides who are fighting the election are not willing to yield in any form, there is nothing called as genuine misinformation, as however
Right. Mhm.
crazy that term may sound. It is actually disinformation, because someone who's sitting behind and pushing that out definitely knows it is not true, definitely knows that it will create a poor information ecosystem, definitely knows that it will lead to people voting in a very different way, and not contesting the election in a fair manner. What do we call that? That is disinformation.
Right. Just to add that, just as a follow-up question to that, did we see any content related to, like, I mean, we did see it. We did talk about voter suppression. Just wanted to get more details on content related to voter suppression across platforms. What was your observation on that?
Nothing that comes on in my mind, directly. But as I said, EVMs, a lot of the stuff that we saw around EVMs, those were intended with the intention behind that was to actually confuse voters and to tell voters, that you cannot trust anything that you're seeing, or the fact, there were a lot of in fact, we did one media literacy video which we actually decided to do it, not planned, but only when we saw that there was so much confusion in terms of what do, you go inside the booth, when should you press the button, after you press the button you have to wait for a light, and so there was a lot of confusion around this. Now, I do understand that election commission did some work around it, but still there was a lot of confusion around it, and people were asking us whether this is true or not, whether they should wait, how much time should they wait, take to see whether, so there was a lot of confusion around it, which is why many of us did make media literacy videos around it, to say that how you should be doing it. Then there were some confusion about whether your Aadhaar card is necessary, whether it is linked to whether the election commission is asking for it to be linked or not, or any other form of identity card, will it be allowed or not. There were a lot of rumors around the fact that some entire communities were removed from the voting list. Now, some of it we know. Now, a lot of it is actually also anecdotally. We do know that in some areas it has happened, but can we say that it is a trend? We don't know. So, which is why we told many people who asked us this that we don't have real data to prove it. Don't get carried away by that. Do definitely go to the polling booth and check whether your name is there or not. And there are other ways to check it online as well. Don't believe that that just because you are from a particular community and you live in an area where there is a high chance that your name will not be found in the list. Many people get discouraged. Many people decide that they will not go to the polling booth. There are other forms of it, Saraswati, that we saw, that the political narratives that were being run, that one political party is going to win the election irrespective of whatever happens. I find that to be another form of voter suppression, right? Or vote suppression. That is why a lot of the political parties were taking extra efforts to going out, reminding that no, yes, definitely you still have to go out and vote. So that can also be a form of vote suppression, though there is no real
Yeah.
disinformation. Every political party is free to say that they're going to win the election hands down.
Right. Abhilash, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make that last point that Jency made. I mean, voter suppression that we saw in India wasn't the same as what we see probably in the US or the UK. Voter suppression in India happens in different forms. So one thing that Jency mentioned was talking about how EVMs are rigged, or EVMs will not give you your vote will not go to the right person. So those kind of those kind of things impact the voter and sort of discourages them from going out and voting. Another thing that people do, I mean, sometimes it's party members, sometimes it's supporters of the party. What they do is they edit the exit poll results or the opinion poll results just before the voting. So it sort of gives that perception that our party is going to win, so you don't need to go out and vote, or it gives you the opposite perception that your party is definitely going to lose. So there's no point of you in going and voting. So that is again another form of voter suppression that happens. So it varies from sort of the context and the places where it is seen, but this is how voter suppression in India probably works.
All right, just to go a level deeper, and I think Kritika, you could answer this. What type of misinformation did we see dominating different platforms? Like, I just want to get an assessment of how X was different from Instagram, Instagram varied from YouTube, and how YouTube was different from WhatsApp. If you could get your thoughts.
I don't think so. I can give you a platform-wise breakup. I don't think so. I can say that one category of misinformation or one kind of misinformation was more viral on a particular platform. I don't think so. That'd be fair for me to say. I think in terms of themes, if we want to go back to discussing the themes, most of the misinformation that we saw was still around a lot of political bickering. To be very honest, one politician blaming the other blaming the first one, which is rooted in misinformation. There was, of course, a lot of communal misinformation where we saw communities being pitted against one another. And I think a lot of that, the surge in that misinformation started happening after the first phase of polling. Again, I don't want to get into names and parties, but that is something that we noticed. Then, of course, there was a lot of conversation around MCC as well. While there was conversation around MCC, I think there was also, again, some kind of contextualization that was required and some kind of information that was required, because not everybody is aware of what are the rules under the Model Code of Conduct. So we did see some kind of misinformation here and there around that as well. There were a couple of videos which were floating on WhatsApp, on Facebook, Instagram, and other platforms. There was, of course, misinformation around EVMs, as something Abhilash and Jency have already pointed out. Voter suppression, old videos from, earlier elections, be it assembly elections or be it Lok Sabha elections, that were shared to say that your votes are being tampered with, irrespective of which party you vote for, the vote is going to go to XYZ party. So these were essentially the dominating themes, or these were the major themes around which we saw a lot of misinformation. Yes, before the elections were announced, we also did see some amount of misinformation around electoral bonds, because that's when the entire data set came out and the conversation was around that. So we did see some amount of it, not too much of it, but yeah, there was definitely conversation around electoral bonds as well.
All right. Yeah, Rajni.
One of the things that we saw in this election was that the election commission itself was a lot more hands-on in trying to debunk things that came out. So they launched this myth versus reality portal for, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying we are going to come to the election commission later.
Oh, okay.
Is there any specific that you would want to add with regards to the platforms, type of misinformation dominating across platforms, and how did they differ?
One of the things is the WhatsApp definitely serves an early warning system to what may be going viral. You would typically find information that you found on one platform on another as well. I guess video platforms had their own this one. I remember Abhilash had done one story on how there was this campaign to remove the Chief Justice of India, and YouTube actually did act on that video and took down that video. But you need to see that specific channel. It may have been demonetized, but sometimes I don't think even monetization is really the motivator for some of these people to spread the kind of information that they do.
Right.
And if you would see the live streams, and it would be 3 hour live streams every day, you'd be surprised because the title of that live stream and then what was being said, not a single part of it is true. So we do definitely see, and also like I think with platforms, what tends to happen is we tend to disproportionately focus maybe on X quite a bit because all of us are on X. We tend to focus quite a bit on Meta because Meta platforms and because we're third party fact checkers to them. So in many ways, you may therefore realize that the time it takes to find misinformation, find and detect misinformation on YouTube is a lot more. So you don't spend that much. And this was the first election where we also saw creators intermingling with politics in a very big way. And to go through some of these interviews, which are 3 hours long, at an election time, fact checkers already don't have that kind of bandwidth to do that much of work. So you're really looking at what is going viral, what has some consequence that you want to kind of look into.
Yes, influencer content. Actually, it's an interesting point that you brought up. Does anyone want to add to it? All right, we can go ahead then, and we can focus more on platform regulation and ECI's role in combating misinformation. I think I'd like Simone to take over now.
Right, absolutely. Thank you so much, Rajiv and Saraswati. So what I did want to talk is, Jansi mentioned this briefly. How effective have platforms been in taking down reported content? Now, as I understand, Rajiv said that it's harder to find misinformation, but based on your operational data and what you have observed, how effective are they taking down reported content? Avilash, maybe you could answer this.
So, like Jency and Rajni also pointed out, we are a 3PC partner with Meta. So a lot of the work that we had done during the elections were with Meta on their different platforms. So it was Facebook, Instagram, and to an extent on Threads. So how the rating works, I mean, it's pretty clear that you could rate pieces of content, and then the reach of that particular piece of content could then decrease. So we didn't have to actively reach out to Meta and and ask them to take down a piece of content. We had that communication already in place. When it came to other platforms like X, we reached out to them multiple times. Our fact checkers are also people who write community notes and rate community notes. So they were actively doing that on the platform, but there is a major imbalance that is there, even in the community notes kind of writing space, where it is dominated by one side, and even us fact checkers are not enough to sort of put out a verified piece of content quickly. So it takes a lot of time for the correct community rating to show up on any piece of any post on X. And then reaching out to them never yields any results. So that has never been our experience. When it came to YouTube, we've done a few stories. One was specifically talking about the campaign against the CJI to sort of remove him. There were multiple channels which would put out thumbnails where they would say that President Murmu has fired the CJI, or someone else has filed a case against the CJI. Those kind of videos, which again, in the video, they would talk about something completely different, nothing related to what the thumbnail says. And sometimes they would conquer up this imaginary situation where there was a closed door debate, a discussion between the CJI and the President of India, and the President of India had apparently asked the CJI to leave. So that is something that we had noticed on YouTube. Then other things that we noticed were videos where the thumbnails had edited photos of politicians and also Bollywood celebrities. So that is also something that we kept flagging to YouTube. Like I earlier pointed out, some of these channels were demonetized. Some of the content was deleted. Some of the election misinformation was again either demonetized or deleted, but a lot of content stayed up. I would say action was taken against maybe hardly 15 to 20% of the content that we had shared. And a lot of other content was still up, and we didn't get a report or a response on what the other pieces of content, what happened to the other pieces of content that we had flagged to them. Yeah, so that has been our experience in this solution.
Thank you, Abhilash. Would anyone like to add to that? Kritika, probably. And also, if you would like to talk about community notes and how effective they have been.
So that's something that we were looking at throughout the elections, community notes specifically, and there are multiple people from our team who do write community notes. Now, the thing is that, of course, X wants to ensure that they are asking people from across the spectrum to rate those notes before the rating goes up. The process, because of that, is extremely slow. So probably by then, millions of people have interacted with the post and the note will not go up because there's a lot of internal bickering that's happening. There's a lot of disagreement that's happening between the people who are rating those notes. So by the time you rate it, there's an approval and it goes up. So it's not a very, very effective mechanism because it's again crowdsourcing of information, which sounds like a good idea, but it's like too many people who are working on it. So by the time it goes out, it's actually probably most of the people who had to interact with the information, they've already interacted with it. And there is very limited contextualization of information. I'm sorry, I do sound like a broken record when I'm saying it, but I think it's very, very important because not everything that we see online is misinformation or is fake news, right? A lot of it is information that's taken out of context. A lot of it needs to be contextualized. So those notes are also taking a lot of time to go up. That it has been our experience with community notes, and that's something that we've been dealing with, or we saw a lot. We tried getting in touch with X for even the stories that we've done or the stories that we are currently working on around community notes as well. For other platforms, as I mentioned, that Meta, there is no specific claim, or there were not multiple claims around which we wrote to them. Also, because we're not a 3PFC partner, so we don't rate content on Facebook. We did send them an email around the story that we did on ads that Meta allows users to run, political ads specifically, looking at how communally charged some of those ads were and how they were also rooted in misinformation. Last when I checked, which was about 10 days back, those ads were still running. I don't know if they've been taken down now or something's changed. But by the time, at the time of publishing of the story, the ads were still very much up. YouTube, I don't remember any particular instance, at least off the top of my head right now, I can't remember any particular instance where we wrote to YouTube around political misinformation. But yes, we do look at YouTube for a lot of health misinformation. We do track YouTube when it comes to other themes and topics as well. And we do write to them. Not always, honestly, the response is quite low. The response rate is very low. And in my experience, all of these years, I have not seen them take down content, or I've not had a response from them where they say that, they've removed the content because it's misinformation or something like that. So yeah.
Thank you. Jency and Rashi, would you like to add anything to that?
See, I have a point about community notes. In fact, we also wrote a whole detailed story, and Kritika explained it well as well. Since see, many of the fact checkers have already pointed this out, that you cannot fully automate yeah, fact checking, and that is what X wants to do. They don't want to work with fact checkers. They don't want to probably have any association with fact checkers, because that would invite a lot of scrutiny into their own processes as well, which is why they are using this route of community notes. Now, one big problem with community notes is that because they are trying to keep everyone happy, and they feel that there is an X side and a Y side, and everyone needs to be given a view, which is not how fact checking works. What usually you will end up seeing is that people will keep bickering, which means that it takes a lot of time for that note to come up, and then there will be a lot of to and fro that is happening, and not the best information which should come up will come up at the same time. So that is one observation about community notes. The second thing is about even Meta or any other platform, while we as fact checkers work towards pointing out all those, either those are ads or pages or information or videos that should not be there, we found that only in extreme cases does the platform act. Otherwise, they're quite lethargic when it comes to taking it down. In fact, many of the ads that we ourselves flagged as well, we found that that they still exist, continue to exist on the ad platform. So it is not as if they immediately take action just because we work with the platforms. That's a misunderstanding that many people do have about the work that fact checkers do. While we tag a lot of them, there is a distribution which is reduced. There's no doubt about it. Some of the posts that may have been viral in a big way, after they get flagged, the distribution is taken down. But platforms don't like to completely remove posts unless it is very violent in nature, or it is violating a lot of guidelines, or the community guidelines that they have, or there is so much focus, political focus, that they are forced to take it down. Otherwise, they're quite lethargic when it comes to completely taking down posts.
Tarunima, would you like to add something to that?
No, not really. And we're not in the business of actually escalating to platforms. But yeah, so I won't add anything there.
Okay. So yeah,
I think
Rajni, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah. So two things that I think in many ways what we're also asking for is for the context to be added rather than, just here. I think the removal aspect only comes when it violates a lot of other community guidelines. It could be hate speech. It could be, there's imminent threat of harm or danger. I think at least we've noticed sometimes what YouTube is good at removing is an actual fact check video that you've published for violation of community guidelines and not giving you a EDSA exception. EDSA is educational, documentary, scientific, or artistic.
All right. Speaking of that, Google and YouTube have this policy that is just a variation of an information bar where they point to, sources that are more reliable. Have they been effective in mitigating misinformation? Abhilash, do you want to answer that?
To an extent, yes. I mean, we used to get that sort of small message that to find authentic information, go to the ECI website, or things like those about EVMs. If there was a keyword EVM in the video, that we get that message. But again, I mean, it's difficult to even find genuine information on some of these websites, on the government websites that we go to. Finding genuine information on them is difficult. That is where fact checkers come in. That is where we make it simple for the readers to understand what is the context behind anything that is going viral, what is and where exactly to find it on the Election Commission's website or on any genuine trusted news source. So while it did help, perhaps did help a bit, but because of how government websites are built, I don't think it would have made much difference, and that is why we've been advocating for the other platforms to also work with fact checkers so that we make it easier for their readers and the viewers to find the correct information.
Right. Speaking of which, if you could make any changes in their policies, what would you suggest to platforms? So I think let's start with Kritika.
So I think one thing that I'd like to suggest is that, we're increasingly seeing people sharing information or misinformation as satire, as memes. And I understand that it's very difficult for platforms to have policies around all categories, a policy that covers all of it. But when we are seeing increasingly and repeatedly bad faith actors circumvent these policies and utilize all of these, all these media, utilize something like a satire or a meme to spread misinformation, I do think it's time for them to act on it. I do think they cannot keep passing off something as humor and keep sharing misinformation. That is definitely something I do think it's high time, and I'm not saying it's for one platform or the other. I do think it's something that all the platforms need to really focus on or need to see, because memes and satire have become great vehicles of misinformation, because that's something you wouldn't want to fact check, or you can't fact check because it's essentially humor at the end of the day. So I do think you need policies, especially when you're talking about ads, because there are people who are spending money on those ads and then they're reaching a wider audience. And those ads are also, made in a certain humorous way. So how do you fact check it and say that no, it's incorrect information, because one can argue that it's humor, we're just kidding. So I do think that there are certain regulations which are required, because you are again and again seeing that how a person is able to circumvent those policies.
Right. Kritika, I see where you're coming from, but again, this raises concerns about freedom of speech, for example. So should this be under the control of platforms? Like, should they come up with policies, or should they work with the government? What do you think?
So I'm not suggesting that they should censor the content. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that they should I'm not even saying that you should regulate content, or you should stop people from posting memes or satire. Of course, that's for fun. And of course, that's freedom of expression and speech. So one should be allowed to do what they want to do. But I'm just saying, when it's rooted in misinformation, or when it's spreading divisive narratives, I do think you should have policies in place, especially when you have repetitive bad faith actors, when you have an individual doing it multiple times. I'm not talking about every user. I'm not talking about people who are unknowingly or inadvertently spreading misinformation, right? I'm talking about disinformation. I'm talking about bad faith actors who are habitual offenders.
All right, right. Rajni, what would you suggest as a change in policy in platforms and across all platforms?
I mean, not a change in policy, but maybe having individual points of contact that we can all reach out to. Like Meta, we still speak to, but in many other cases, like we just don't know who to reach out to for what. It's really like a maze to even, like, we report on platform, for example, we don't know where it's going. Is there a escalation that we can do, for example, or priority escalations to ensure that it's being looked at? We don't even have that. So at least in the time of elections, if not anything else, could platforms create this channel of communication with us where we're able to bring things to their notice much more quickly than having to go through uh, a nameless, faceless process where we may not even hear back.
All right. Would anyone else like to add to that?
Yeah, could I go? Okay, so yes, enforcement of policies, that's something we saw, that there were policies around AI generated content but not enforced, or properly enforced, even in cases where it was easy to detect. So that's one. The second is that we're seeing the modalities change, right? So we're saying that now from text we're going to short videos or videos. And to what extent do platforms provide tools even to fact checkers to be more efficient in fact checking those, right? So typically when we think about there's something called the ABCDE model, where the A stands for actor, B stands for behavior, C stands for content, right? This is a way to understand the information ecosystem, and a lot of fact checking is focused on the content piece. And what we've heard so far is that not enough platforms are even focusing on that the content piece. So that's definitely a place where there can be more attention. But I think what I would also say is that there can be a lot more towards the actor and the behavior side, which is that it's increasingly hard for anyone who is not at a platform to understand coordinated action, to understand repetitive behavior, to understand inauthentic behavior, right? And often it is when people have called it out from the outside that it has pressured platforms to act on it on the inside. So what we're seeing in terms of restricted data access, CrowdTangle being closed down, right? All of that also feeds into a lot of the trust and safety work that happens by actors outside of platforms. So I think platforms should make it possible and not penalize people trying to do some of this work outside.
Right. So now that we've spoken about platforms, we'd also like to speak about the Election Commission and their actions. So, Saraswati, would you like to take over?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, I would like to go to Shivam and let's just talk about the challenges for the ECI in this election, and identifying and sort of taking down misinformation. Shivam, is Shivam there?
Saraswati, I believe Shivam has dropped off.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Jency, maybe you could
Yeah.
add to that.
So I feel that the Election Commission could have done so much, but their actions have been quite underwhelming, especially because as fact checkers we meet fact checkers around the world, and we hear about how in many of the countries they work very closely with one fact checking alliance or the other, and not just fact checkers but even journalists, and associations, to either in the form of media literacy or to surface good information, or to also pull down a lot of the misinformation that would be spreading around on certain polling days and during counting days as well. So there's a lot of work that is happening around the world. I'm not very sure whether the election commission is paying attention to it. Apart from that, we all spoke about deep fake, and it's been my considered position that uh, the election commission should have brought the political parties on a common platform and made them agree to a code of conduct on how they are going to use AI generated content in their campaigning. Now, to say that that political parties should not use AI generated content at all
Mhm.
is to actually hold on to a very idealistic position. Maybe that may not work, but there has to be a code of conduct. So if you bring the political parties to sign a code of conduct, and I'm sure that the election commission does have the wherewithal to do it. Sometimes they can nudge, sometimes they can push themselves to do it, or they can use the full force of the powers they have to force the election parties to force the political parties to come to a conclusion, that what are the boundaries, let there be rules, let there be ground rules. What will they use, what will they not use, what are the no go areas? At least let's start a discussion. My point is that maybe political parties may not readily agree to do this, but we didn't even see a discussion. I'm surprised that we went into an entire general election without the election commission even talking about it. Or maybe they spoke about it, but I have not heard them talking about it. This is the
I
first
think
point. The second point,
yeah,
yeah,
sorry, go on. I'll add
the
to
second
it.
point is now that's a very quick point. We
Mhm.
saw them writing letters to the spokespersons without naming the political party leaders. Let me name them: either Narendra Modi or Rahul Gandhi. Both of the leaders were not even named. What does that say about the confidence that probably an ordinary voter will get when he sees the news report where a letter has been written to the spokesperson asking them to tell their political leaders or to campaign properly and not use divisive communal claims. Now that is something that says something about the confidence that the election commission has in its own powers.
Right. So just a follow-up question to that, in terms of the measures that they have implemented, now we came across an investigation by Boom. I think Decode had done that story, where the ECI's C-Vigil app was found to have this loophole wherein you could not upload pre-recorded images or videos or links to misinformation that people would like to report online. And so, like looking at these concerns, how responsive has the ECI been to complaints it had received? How can they just improve what they've already implemented?
No, they do claim that that app they received a lot of complaints and they have acted on it, but we didn't find that to be that responsive either. But a lot of this, I mean, I understand that it's a large country.
Hmm.
They have very limited resources. They don't have the kind of resources. I've gone to state election commission meetings in the past, not now, not during this election, but in a few years back, where I've understood, where they come from. They are well-meaning. They have some real valid concerns. They want to act, but they don't have the real resources to do it. But even to begin with, the fact that they are not even initiating discussions on some of the very key topics that we are talking about. Deepfake is something that we spoke about even 6 months back. All the fact checkers were talking about it, journalists were talking about it, even political parties were discussing, at least making the right noises, saying that that it should not be misused. The government was talking about it in many ways, as saying that it should not be misused. But I hardly heard the election commission really making any serious noises about it.
All right. So, what were the measures? Like, what are your observations on the measures or guidelines that they have already adopted, and were they effective? Like, is there anything that has really been effective this elections? And others can
No,
add to it.
I think one of the things that the Election Commission tried to undertake was to specifically focus on the EVM, among other things. And that's where they launched this myth versus reality portal, where they were trying to consistently dispel. But as Gen Z mentioned, like, while this was one thing, there were a lot more things they could have done, which perhaps didn't happen in many ways that could have happened. Uh, and yeah, we did see advisories, we did see I mean, I think we read a Reuters report, for example, about how the election, I think it was Reuters, but yeah, about how the election commission had set up teams everywhere to look at it. I think the question which Shivam could have answered is really what kind of inflows came into the election commission and how much that did they really act on. Like, many times we know of complaints of mcc violation complaints, but we don't know how many of them were actually acted upon, or we come to know much later. By then it may not even be consequential. So I think though there are some gaps which we'd like to know more about.
Abhilash, do you want to add to it? Abhilash and Kritika.
I think there was some amount of communication that happened while the election dates were announced, and at that point of time, they said that certain things, there will be a task force, there will be people monitoring disinformation. But as things moved on, we reached out to the ECI multiple times for queries when we were trying to do some fact checks, and we never heard back from them. So while there was some amount of communication happening, there wasn't any sort of communication happening with fact checkers, with probably news publishers as well, on things that needed to be fact checked or things that needed to be put out. And even when there were certain tweets or posts that the ECI in different states would put out, they would call something just fake, or they would just say that this was fake or this is not true, and not provide additional context to it. So that also did not help much in dismissing those rumors or in fact checking those claims. So that is where they sort of lack, in my opinion, apart from what others have also mentioned.
Kritika?
So I think just one tiny thing I want to add is that Election Commission's guidelines on use of artificial intelligence also came in pretty late. If I'm not mistaken, they
Yeah.
came after the first two phases of elections were over. And I also remember that the wording of the guidelines were also slightly vague. They warned people against using sharing anything which was likely to, anything that's likely to manipulate information. It didn't have any clarity on whether it was okay with political parties relying on artificial intelligence for the purpose of campaigning, etc. So I think that's also something that's that happened a little late. All of us anticipated, as something we've pointed out multiple times throughout this discussion, that we all anticipated AI to be a very big challenge. We all anticipated how parties are going to rely on technology for not just campaigning, but also for um, luring the voters or passing on some information to the electorate, etc. So I think these guidelines came in a little too late, and they were also slightly vague in nature, if I may say that.
Right. So in terms of the complaints that the ECI has received, like based on an RTI that Medianama had filed, we learned that the ECI had issued only 9 content takedown orders between March 2024 and May 15. These were like 6 to Twitter, 2 complaints were to Meta, and 1 was sent to YouTube. Just wanted to understand, do these numbers make sense? Like between March and May, they've sent 9 content takedown orders across platforms. Any inputs on this?
No, they don't make sense to me. But now the question to also ask is that what were those content takedowns? See, I
Yeah,
have
we did ask that. I'm so sorry.
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
But I think they said this information was not to be disclosed because it does not have larger public interest, is what they said.
Okay,
We
so
asked for
I'm not sure.
copies of those content takedown orders to get an idea of what really it is. They just gave us the number and the
Yeah, so I'm not sure what did they ask for, but I mean, as we discussed earlier, suppose if it is about EVM rigging allegations or generally trying to create distrust in the EVM machinery, then then I understand, that probably they are rightly placed to do it. But you know, I see this process has to be transparent. That's all that I'm saying.
Exactly.
It's not that EC has the highest trust in the minds of its of the citizens. So definitely a lot of work has to be done in that direction. So to I mean, any content takedown again, they send alarm bells ringing, because you don't know what are they asking for to be taken down. So rather than that, they should have worked very closely with fact checkers. They should have worked, um, and they don't need to work with individual fact checkers. I understand, that they would have issues with that, but they can work with larger journalistic organizations, not just fact checkers, but even there are television organizations, there are print organizations. I don't know whether they have done any campaign along with them. Maybe they have, but you know, unfortunately, the EC always seems to be in firefighting mode. They don't need to be. In fact, even the dates they announced, they came under a lot of scrutiny. That why, when they knew that the elections are going to be in the month of April, why did the election dates go so long? Why there were so many multiple phases? I mean, that is not pertaining to our discussion here, but these are some of the concerns that people have when it comes to EC. That the process is not transparent. They don't discuss. They don't probably have a public discussion about this. There are so many issues to unpack here, and I hope they do the next elections properly.
All right. So, how do you think ECI can improve its collaboration with social media platforms and as well as fact checkers to, for future elections to ensure that misinformation? Okay, Taranama, you wanted to add something to the previous point, previous question?
Yeah, it might sort of feed into your question as well. I think in the
Right.
run up to the elections, a lot of us, whether we are fact checkers, policy groups, a lot of people are trying to reach out to the ECI, trying to understand its position, even if it wasn't on deepfakes, on misinformation, online misinformation, because the ECI did have a 5-year benefit from 2019 to now, right? And at least in certain conversations with also like global organizations that work on democratic processes, someone had pointed it out to me and said that, while you all are very concerned about your election commission, what we can tell you is that we recommend India as the model to a lot of other countries, because as far as developing countries, lower middle income countries go, the ECI is a fairly well functioning organization institution in India as opposed to some of the other countries, right? So it was a very interesting remark to me, because as much as we were concerned about capacity and we were concerned about why the ECI was not reacting or acting in certain ways, the ECI globally is considered to be a better institution than some of the other countries, right? That's just like, I think, interesting background. That is not to say that the ECI does not need to act on some of these emerging threats, but that there's always like a capacity constraint around actually running the elections itself in India, and then also having the bandwidth to have the foresight, or like the bandwidth to think about doing like long term thinking and addressing some of the newer threats, right? I'm not saying that it doesn't need to happen, but it from conversations it feels like capacity is what everyone's always complaining about. Yeah.
Yeah, Jency.
So, I mean, I give the other example is of Brazil. The last election they had, their equivalent of their election commission, uh, there were agreements that were signed with fact checkers, with WhatsApp, and they built a bot, and there were millions of voters who were able to reach out through the bot and access information which they felt probably was relevant to them, or send out claims that they saw. Now, this needs to happen at some level or the other. The election commission needs to think in this direction. I understand that it's not easy, because they have too much on their plate to worry about, but there are fact checkers readily available. There is an entire system available where fact checkers know how to do it. uh, there are platforms who are willing to work with the election commission. Probably all of this needs to come together, and they need to apply their minds. They should look at the Brazil example. I'm not saying that's the best example. They also had their own set of problems despite putting those systems in place, but some system is better than not having it all.
Right. Rajneel, Abhilash, and Kritika, would you like to add to the point of how ECI can collaborate better and work amidst whatever constraints that they have currently?
Nothing to add from what Jency already mentioned, right? We have seen these models elsewhere. So we obviously wonder why can't it also work in India? In many ways, certain capacity constraints that ECI has is something that maybe where we can kind of come in and fill that gap uh, in many ways. And while we would unofficially maybe get to hear of things from their handler or somebody would randomly send you something, there was no formal communication that happened with the ECI, and maybe that's something we should perhaps work on to understand how can you have a formal relationship with them and where you really know what you need to do, how it needs to be done. There is expertise and there are many people who can do that.
So, like, just wanted to understand what's the current situation. Like, I mean, there's no communication at all between ACI and the fact checkers, and was just curious.
I mean, yeah, at least from a news checker perspective, we've not spoken to them, saying we can do this or, we can do that. I do remember that at least in 2019, there was the IMAI voluntary code of ethics that ECI had done with platforms, right? It is something that I think is still in force. So I know that ECI is talking to platforms, but there's never been a conversation with fact checkers directly.
Yeah, that has been the same experience with us also. We have reached out actively for clarifications or for additional information on several occasions, but we haven't heard back from them at all.
Right. Kritika?
Honestly, I don't have anything very different to say. I just think it's important for us to have a seat at the table, and I completely understand constraints. But I think what Jency said, it's not about only working with individual fact checkers. There are alliances. Even for fact checkers, there are alliances that exist. So it's just important to have that conversation. It's important to have that sort of transparency because of course, when we're talking about elections, it is a very big task in India, but you're
Right.
also talking about the kind of information people will be exposed to during those elections. So I think that's that's an equally important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kritika. So now we would just like to go around and hear what is one lesson everyone has learned throughout this election, and what do you think we should keep in mind going forward? And then we'll open up the questions to audience. So everyone who has questions can put them in the chat right now. Let's start with Tarunama. What is something you've learned, we should keep in mind going forward? Sorry, no pressure.
I actually was thinking, can I pass to someone else and come back? You all can come back to me.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Would someone else like to pick it up? Jency?
So, no, I mean, offhand, what I can think about is, see, fact checkers definitely know their bread and butter, how it has to be, bread and butter stories to be done. So we know how, you can wake us up in the night, in the middle of the night, and we can fact check that. That is not going to be much of trouble. Where I think we are going to struggle are again going to be AI generated content. Now, all of us are, there's a lot of relief that we were not really tested when it came to deepfakes. It was quite tough. I mean, every phase of the election, when we were looking at it, we were wondering now, okay, this is what we did. The last deepfake story we fact checked. Now, is there something more dangerous or more difficult that probably our skills will not be able to figure? The other trouble is that we don't really have the tools available. So our biggest lesson, in fact, I feel the biggest lesson is that I hope that there is some startup somewhere in the world which is looking at this as a social problem, and they're going to figure out a free tool with some help from the platforms, and build a tool which all fact checkers can use. Because with the existing, now, like we did 12 stories, those 12 stories we really had to sweat a lot, and it was only possible because there were certain tools that were available. uh, a couple of academics who are running this, their own tools. There's another startup which is doing this, but I understand, that they are investing a lot of time and resources into it. So they're not getting paid for this, and they should be getting paid for this effort. So I hope that platforms take this very seriously and they incubate a startup which will look at these tools. Otherwise, the the relief that Rajneel was talking about, that democracy was not destabilized, it will be destabilized at some point. And it will take only one deepfake video to actually do that. So that's my biggest learning, from this.
Thank you. Abhilash?
I think one of the biggest learnings that came from this election was working together, collaborating with a lot of fact checkers on certain projects, like the deepfakes analysis unit, where we used to keep posting the videos or deepfakes that we used to get, and get context from other fact checkers, and also work with scientists and people who have built tools to identify detection models, identify detection images. So that was my biggest learning. That I mean, even the scale that there was misinformation was on a huge scale, but because we were working together and was sharing of information was happening, we could do good work this time.
Yeah. Thank you. Rajni?
Yeah, I think because in this selection we were very focused on, oh, what could AI do? Sometimes it's the very simple techniques of misleading that really still get used, and we shouldn't discount the power that that has to continue misleading people. That, of course, was one learning, that old methods will reign supreme still, at least till the time, those who want to manipulate will reach the next level. And as Abhilash said, I think alliances really work. I think it was helpful for fact-checking newsrooms to chat with each other sometimes, get an idea of who's working on what, to sometimes share evidence collaboratively to ensure that the fact check gets out faster. So I think the alliance and the fact that we were all able to work together, and you're able to see like people just now referring to each other, that was the camaraderie that got built up, and I think that is good.
Just based on that, one of our questions is asked, has there been more um, alliance this time with respect to elections as compared to the other times? And has that helped with the fact checking in this election with respect to a collaborative approach?
Yeah,
I think that's sorry, Simon, to interrupt. I think it's about collaboration between fact checkers and the larger media ecosystem. Is that the question that you were looking at?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, we can just read out the entire question. I think it's directed to Gen Z.
Okay.
As someone who has been in the space the longest, did you see a better sense of collaboration among fact checkers and the larger media ecosystem in these elections compared to earlier attempts to amplify collaborative efforts? Do you have any learnings for the next time?
Yeah, so that is true, because this is the first election where fact checkers came together, because we didn't have the MCA earlier. We now have the MCA, so it was much more easier to bring all the fact checkers together. Apart from this, there were two alliances that happened, one sponsored by GNI, the other by Meta. So both Shakti and the deepfake analysis unit were examples of alliances that can work together, which is why I said that even the election commission should be working with the fact checkers, because now we have a model in place where fact checkers have kind of developed a level of comfort with each other. We know what are the no-go areas, what are the areas where we would like to collaborate. So a lot of key learnings that have taken place both from Shakti as well as the deepfake analysis unit. So also Shakti has shown that probably fact checkers and the larger mainstream media organization ecosystem can work together. They don't probably have the resources to fact check to the level that probably fact checkers are doing. And maybe they don't want to build an entire fact checking newsroom as well. It may not be in their interest and their commercial goals as well. So they can work with fact checkers, during a key election. So this is definitely possible, and there are some very good lessons we have learned from it, and we have also benefited because we've seen how our stories have been redistributed to a wider audience, like in languages where we are not present, and in states where probably we wouldn't have been read, our stories are being read. So it's a good learning, and we hope that this will be taken forward in the coming days.
Yeah, thank you, Jansi. Kritika, would you like to add your learning and what we should keep?
So I think one thing I want to add is that we've also learned that we definitely need more classifiers, especially when we're talking about deepfakes and artificial intelligence in non-English languages. And I think, again, one of the speakers did give an example of an audio clip that went viral, which was not in English, which was in Telugu. And it was sort of hard for us to get it checked while the tools were able to give us a result, and most of the tools were able to give us a common result. One constant conversation that we were having, not just as logically facts, but also as a part of the DAU with other members of the DAU, was that the possibility that all of these tools are not trained to understand the language itself. So I think it is definitely something that we need to think more about and need to probably work more on. That is classifiers which are not just specific to English or other languages, but basically something that also covers regional languages in India. And the second thing is something that I think everybody has spoken about is collaboration. But that's also specific to languages. I just wanted to make a point. For instance, we publish fact checks in 5 languages. We, for instance, do not publish fact checks in Bangla. But we happen to receive a claim from West Bengal, and we don't have the means, or we don't have the resources to be able to fact check it and put it out. In a collaboration, it becomes easier for you to share it with the others. Even if you can't do it, others can do it. At least the facts can still be put out. So I think those are two big learnings for me from these elections.
Thank you, Krishna.
So, Moon, should I go?
Yes.
Finish what I did say earlier. Yeah, I actually was just thinking how to not sound overly optimistic to the point of losing track of what's really happening. But I think for me, one of the sort of key takeaways was that a lot of incremental work over multiple years led to certain things coming together in this election, right? So whether it's the MCA, whether it's the projects, right? I think fact checkers have been doing sort of post after post, and I'm sure like at times it feels like what is this even leading to in the long run, right? But I think some of the things that were mentioned in the talk today, which is that people being fatigued of misinformation, well, I think a lot of it is also coming from endless media literacy sessions, people doing these fact checkers and fact checks and telling people that these exist, right? So one, that yeah, incremental work, even if it is not visible, the impact is not visible in the short run, does culminate to something or lead to something productive in the long run. I think the other bit is that um, last year was a year when a lot of platforms laid off their trust and safety teams, which was actually a very bad time to do that. And so even in this year, when you have like 60 plus countries going to election, where platforms needed to be sort of as beefed up as possible, they actually had lesser capacity, right? So I do think that distilling like rhetoric applied by platforms, governments, and matching it against what's actually happening is important. This space does need a lot of attention. AI is one threat vector, but there are others. And so, yeah, like just realizing that actually in a year that needed so much attention, there was actually lesser capacity on platforms, and we weren't making as big a deal of it as we were making it, sort of were thinking it was in 2016, right? So just like the mismatch between rhetoric and reality was another one for me. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. So we'll take questions now. So we have a question here that says, how do you guys categorize info as fake, false, and misleading if you do differentiate between them? Thinking this in context of the Bombay High Court's ongoing hearings on the fact check amendment and court saying that such categorization can be problematic. Also, how do you think the fact checking scene in India will change if the amendment goes through? So this
I
is
think
something.
Rajnil should take this question.
Okay, thanks. So a couple of things, right? I think when it comes to fake, false, and misleading, we do have multiple categories of information which is very clearly defined. You can either look at, for example, how First Draft had defined some of this, right? It was the earliest seminal work on the conceptual way of defining the different categories of misinformation. To, let's say, what would be a label that we apply when it comes to saying being a third-party fact checker for a platform. So those definitions clearly exist. We also have examples which we try and use to understand what these definitions are. specifically in the context of the Bombay High Court, I think what is being heard is more to do with the government's own fact-checking unit and what they will be and whether they will be able to fact check or not. Specifically from the fact-checking ecosystem perspective, right? Even if a fact-checking unit is set up, it's not going to stop us from undertaking the work we are supposed to, because what it does is it places the way the FCU is structured and the obligations it places is actually on platforms. It's not going to be on fact checkers and their operations per se. What could likely happen is there could be cases where the conclusion that fact checkers arrive might be different from what the fact checking unit, if it's set up, may arrive at. Then what are platforms going to do is a question. But I mean, I personally don't think that it will impact, I mean, the way the Bombay High Court verdict goes and however it escalates will not immediately impact our operations, and we will continue doing the work that we already are doing. Others are free to join in.
Would anyone else like to add to that? No? All right. Okay. So another question we have is, what is typically the time lag between a news going viral and it getting fact checked? And does the virality of the news reduce after it has been fact checked? I think this is important. So, who'd like
Maybe
to?
Abhilash or Jency can take that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the content there. Sometimes like I said, there were a lot of pieces of information that were shared back in 2019, which were reshared in 2024. So it didn't take us much time in that case to fact check something. So we would publish a fact check on that in maybe a few hours, depending on what links are still active and or not. But in some cases, it takes us a couple of days. We have to reach out to authorities. We have to get correct information from different sources, our reporters on the ground. So it depends on how the claim is framed, how the complex the claim is. In most cases, at least from the meta POV, the virality of the claims do decrease. But I mean, it's a known thing that bad actors would again then create a different version of the claim and then share it on the platforms again, in order to bypass the filters that we have already put on them to restrict the reach of a particular post. So that also is something that we noticed often. But once there is a fact check, people on the internet are also active enough to then look for that fact check and then comment under people's tweets when they reshare that piece of content. If either on Facebook or on Twitter, they share our fact checks as a comment or as a reply. So that does help in a bit to reducing the virality.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. We're running out of time. So yeah, Saraswati.
Yeah, just in context of the virality of misinformation, I had a question about, and maybe Tarunima can take this. What are your thoughts on measures that could be taken to combat misinformation transmitted through end-to-end encrypted platforms? This is in context of WhatsApp.
Yeah. So I'd say definitely not traceability. I think finding the point of first origin is not, we were seeing this with Twitter, Facebook, etc. You know where the content has originated. It's not as we've resolved the problem of misinformation there. So the trade-offs of traceability on end-to-end encrypted platforms just don't make sense to me. So I would say not there. I think in terms of what platforms could, so there are like some interesting ideas, and I think a lot of it comes down to either WhatsApp trying these ideas out, but also whether the user experience becomes very clunky. But for example, you can load a database of fact checks on the user's end, and then whatever processing is happening of incoming content happens on the user's end, right? There are things like that. And then similarly, just keeping it to be keeping it to be a messaging platform as opposed to say a broadcasting platform. There's a reason, because of also the way the encryption technology on Signal works, is that the content dissemination is slower because the security provisions on Signal are stronger, right? So because WhatsApp uses a different protocol for encrypting media items so that we are able to forward content faster, right? And Signal does not do that, which again is to say that if you're designing for people to spread content fast, it will spread fast. So you can do also like technical or make certain decisions to make content sort of go slowly or not have it be viral on certain platforms. I don't think it's an easy answer, but I think with like encrypted platforms, takedowns, etc., are harder. Some of the spam filter, like blocking contacts that or blocking phones that are part of multiple networks, where it's clear that this phone number is primarily being used to, just run WhatsApp groups, may or may not be for political campaigning. I think blocking some of those which WhatsApp says it's already doing, I think those are good ideas. Yeah, let's stop at that.
All right. I think we can take one last question. Simon, is that okay?
Yeah. There's a question here that says, with the advent of technological sharing of information, it is likely that the volume and complexity of facts to be checked would only grow from here on. How do the fact checkers plan to tackle this issue? Is it just further specialized hiring that would take place, or will one layer of automated fact checking and second layer of human fact checking be employed? So would someone like to answer this? Krithika?
So I don't think so, at least not in the near future, do I see that human beings can completely be replaced by artificial intelligence, because I think when we're fact checking, there's again a lot of context that needs to be taken into consideration. There's a lot of local context, there's cultural context that needs to be kept in mind while we're writing our fact checks. So I do think that you can leverage technology, you can rely on technology to make things better, to probably, for tasks like claim discovery, for other tasks like which other sources you could rely on, like a repository or something. But I don't think so that we, at least in the immediate future, I don't think so we can look at completely replacing human beings with artificial intelligence. So I do think they can work in conjunction, but I don't think so it can be either or.
Right. All right. Thank you. Is there anything else we'd like to add, Saraswati? I think, right? Yeah.
No, sir.
All right. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for this discussion. This was lovely, and I'm sure we've learned a lot about fact checking and what to keep an eye on in the coming elections. And hopefully, this will be useful for other countries and jurisdictions going into elections within India too. So yes, thank you so much.
And this discussion will be up on YouTube as well for our audience members. And we'll be writing reports on whatever we've discussed today, specifically every session. So yeah, do check out our website for those reports.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.